And it's really an honor to be here. I have not only been involved in Latin America solidarity and immigrant rights since the 1980s, early 1980s. I've also been a fan of NACLA and an avid reader of NACLA since the early 1980s. So it's really nice to be here with you all tonight. And I just want to say something else about the early 1980s when I was finishing college and starting graduate school and everything was happening in Central America. That's all we wanted to talk about as graduate students, but it seemed like there was nobody writing or studying about Central America. We had a Brazilianist, a Mexicanist, and an Argentinaist at UC Berkeley, where I was in school. And slowly, we graduate students in history started finding people here and there. We were really lucky to have people in other departments like Margarita Melville, Beatriz Mons, in anthropology and ethnic studies. But Central America really seemed to be a forgotten region of Latin America. And I feel like so much of that history of the 1980s has been forgotten again, even after we tried to write it. But it's just really exciting to be here with sort of a new generation of scholars who are bringing forward some of the history that the older generation doesn't want to see forgotten. So thank you all. It's really a pleasure to read your work. So I'm going to introduce the speakers one by one, just in case people are coming in and out. And I'd like to ask the three of you to tell us something about the article that's appearing in this issue of NACLA, and I'm going to begin by kind of framing a question about it to set you off. So we're going to start with Scherly Virgill Artiaga, whose article is entitled "The Garifuna Voices of Guatemala's Armed Conflict." Shirley is a digital historian in Black Central American modern history and its diasporas. And talk about forgotten histories. You're writing about like a forgotten history of a forgotten history. The experiences of the Atlantic coast peoples of all of Central America have been marginalized from I think, Central American history and Central America's mainstream. And so tell us what did you learn from your research among the Garifuna people about their experience of the war of the 1980s? And what does that tell us about Guatemala today?
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for coordinating this discussion. And I think that more than for the Garifuna community, more than labeling this community the forgotten community, I think is more uh, the omitted histories that we're trying to unveil. You know, the histories that were not, like I said in the article, they were not told because they were never asked. And this project was it had that focus, right, to try to document these oral histories, because as we know, the armed conflict in Guatemala from the 1960s to 1996 is a 36-year war. You can only imagine what happened to these communities that they've been there, you know, for centuries. And we know we didn't know much about what happened to them during this period of war. So this article provides a brief overview of some of the untold stories, you know, long excluded from Central America official civil war records. You know, very important to understand is that the Garifuna Guatemala endured and survived the armed conflict in silence, you know, and fear for more than, like I said, 3 decades. And the stories for this project talk the community recruited, the military, lost in their land and resources. They were also tortured. They died in combat. They welcomed Maya refugees into in Livingstone, and also participated in the peace process. I mean, if that's not a vast a history, I don't know what else it is. I don't think that working with a community, when I had Dalia, one of my interviewees, talking about how the death of one Garifuna meant, it's like 1 million people died. You can feel the impact of the war on these communities. So it is a collection of stories that were never told. Like I said, they were never asked, and we go from a very small number of interviews that were collected back in 2017, 2018. To a project that we're trying to launch, which we're gonna try to collect more interviews in trying to collect these stories, because the Garifuna community they haven't been recognized by the state. Their stories haven't been recorded in the narrative of the war, and our goal is, and the goal for this article is exactly that, trying to bring attention to these stories so that we can include them in the narrative of the war in Guatemala.
Great, thank you. Next, I would like to introduce Marna Shorack, and also her co-authors who are not here, but I will just mention them, Elizabeth Kennedy and Amelia Frank Vitali. Their article is entitled "A State of Mistrust," and it turns to a country that even those of us who were focusing on Central America in the 1980s tended to leave out, which is Honduras. And yet in some ways, Honduras seems like the key to understanding everything about Central America. And more so in terms of neoliberal Central America, Honduras seems to be the case that most glaringly illustrates things that we're also seeing throughout the isthmus. And that, of course, is a major player. We did not see a lot of migration from Honduras to the US during the 1980s as we did from El Salvador and Guatemala, but we're certainly seeing that today. Mm-hmm. So your article, I felt, really took the issue of violence and our understanding of violence and impunity in Honduras to the next level. So tell us what's going on and how people in Honduras, and especially people in the official apparatus of Honduras, are experiencing the issues of violence and impunity.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you guys for hosting this event, also for the issue on Central America, including your article. I know I don't only speak for myself, but also for Amelia Frank Vitale and Elizabeth Kennedy, who co-authored the article with me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be a part of it. We were really excited throughout the whole process. So thank you, Nakla, for that. And thank you for including us in the panel. So just to give a bit of a background as to how this article and our focus in the article came about is that, so basically with the article, we interviewed around, it's based on interviews with around 15 interviews with police officers, medical examiners, and public prosecutors, which in Honduras are known as fiscales, that we interviewed in 6 different municipalities at the end of 2019. I had been living in Honduras and researching forced migration among children and youth for 3 years at that point. Amelia was as well, and so had Liz. And with this research, or with this particular article, we were wanting to understand better what felt to us like the huge gap between what people and the communities and the populations that we were working with on the ground, and this immense sense of insecurity that really just enwrapped or their lives and their day-to-day, and the gap between those experiences to the narrative of the state, which is this narrative that, for example, that in one part, like that homicides are reducing. So in 2011 and 2012, Honduras had one of the highest homicide or the highest homicide rate in the world. And and since then it has been decreasing. And so the government has really used homicide statistics as well as other things that we discuss in the article to promote this idea that Honduras is actually a lot safer for people than what we really experienced in our interviews and in our research there for 3 years. And so the result of the interviews with the authorities really was a very vivid picture of how deep the sense of distrust in the authorities runs in Honduras, to the point where even the authorities distrust the authorities that they are working with. And so I think one of the stories that really hits that point home is we were visiting this smaller municipality, and we were interviewing a fiscal there, and it was in his office, which was in this newly renovated, by USAID building that it looked like a strip mall kind of structure. It didn't really fit into the little city we were visiting. It was newly painted, air conditioned, and completely fenced and gated. And yet we were sitting in his office, and the fiscal, and just keep in mind that the fiscal is the person in charge of investigating crimes, of charging, of placing charges against those who've committed crimes, and directing the whole investigation. And he himself, his hands were trembling as he talked to us, describing how much he distrusted the police that he had to work with, and that who are in charge of collecting the evidence and collecting bodies, because the police where he was located worked with organized crime. And that was a narrative that was repeated throughout all of many of our interviews, where the prosecutors, in most cases themselves, were in situations where they were in threat. They had been threatened, and instead of reporting it and expecting the state to protect them, many times their own colleagues were telling them, no, just, you have no other option but to flee. Don't report this. In one case, a prosecutor even took his name off of a report, of a record, a file, in order to not be implicated in he had, sorry, just to clarify, he had filed a complaint against a military police officer who had killed, who had committed an extrajudicial killing, and he had reported it. And in order to protect his life, because there is no expectation, and the authorities really will not bring justice, in order to protect his life, he took his name off of the record. And so it just really, the interviews really hit home the point that, and this what we had experienced, and we heard from people themselves who had been fleeing and couldn't rely on the state for protection, but that if the authorities themselves who are in charge of bringing justice cannot protect themselves, how can people who are fleeing expect that from the state? And so we discuss also how the police purge and how that hasn't decreased, hasn't just decreased it hasn't increased people's trust, and also just how aid and how the US's security policies and harmful security policies have been exported into Honduras, and really haven't addressed structural changes, but are more focused on superficial changes, such as which they can also then show as in, as like a soccer field or building a new building, but no actual structural changes that will alleviate the problems that Hondurans are facing, which when you get to the root of it is a lot about poverty and the lack of healthcare and education and social services, and really the lack of state involvement in these communities. So that's that's what we discuss in our article.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Stephanie Hueso with her article, A New Era of Solidarity. So we can end on a slightly more hopeful note, maybe. Stephanie is assistant professor of history at Fordham University. And you also, in your article, I think, really ask us to think about what's happening now in the context of what was happening in the 1980s. And you talk about some of the real differences in the solidarity movement that's being elaborated now. Some of those differences really exciting, and some of them in some ways reflecting the loss of the revolutionary project of the 1980s, the disillusionment that followed the loss, or not complete loss of the revolutionary project, but a very different context in terms of the kinds of change that people believe they're going to be able to bring about right now. But one thing that I also found really interesting in your article is the question of labor, because of course, during the 1970s, 1980s, it was really a struggle to get the US labor movement to break with the Cold War consensus in US foreign policy. And I think today we're looking at a very different labor movement, that there's a lot of labor movement outside the official labor movement. And that's what I saw, one thing being really exciting about your article. So tell us what this new Central America solidarity looks like, and how it's similar and different to the one we knew from the 1980s.
Yeah, one thing that I really wanted to do with this article is kind of think about the continuities and ruptures, right, of the Central American Solidarity Movement. And I thought that focusing on the organization CIMITRA, which is the Center for Workers and Migrant Integration, which is pretty new, it's just a year old in El Salvador, was a good lens to understand this. So very quickly, I learned about CIMITRA when I was working with two Salvadoran activists that worked for the National Day Labor Organizing Network. Actually, one of them is a co-executive director of it. And the first time that they explained it to me, as we're going to create a worker center, one of the first worker centers outside of the US. And to me, that was very interesting because it made me think about the relationship between this transnational relationship, right, of Salvadoran activism. I should say, obviously, this is not just about the Salvadoran community, although this is what I focus on. They themselves having this history of community organizing during the war, whether it was through popular or militant organizing. And so envisioning essentially a center in which sees a person, a migrant, right, not just as a migrant, but as a worker, was pretty new to me, right? The focus on the labor, and this idea essentially is that the person who migrates is a transnational worker, right? And that solidarity, right, support for these communities shouldn't be limited to border, right? It's essentially a borderless concept of workers and migrant rights. And essentially CIMITRA, through its partnership with ENDELON, the National Day Labor Organizing Network, really is trying to create this transnational network that accompanies individuals across geopolitical borders. And looking at that, it was very easy to see where were the continuities of this, I guess we can call it kind of a new solidarity, right? And what are the ruptures? So obviously the focus on mutual aid, the focus on collectivizing food production, right, really stems from this tradition of Central American organizing in Central America, right, during these revolutions, but also in the US with organizations like CSpace, right, in 1980. And what's interesting in terms of thinking about solidarity in the 1980s and now is that we're in 1980s, right? We're under Cold War politics. So there was really a desire to critique, right? Critique capitalism, critique US imperialism, right? In Central America. And as many scholars have noted, after the signing of the peace accords, and as you mentioned, Avi, there is this disillusionment, but also solidarity essentially becomes depoliticized, right? Really a focus on human rights framing, which obviously is important, but it leaves this anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist critique to a certain extent aside. And CIMITRA, I believe, and again, this is just the beginning of this worker-centered organization, still focuses obviously on the human rights, but as I said earlier, with a focus on the worker and in naming them transnational workers, right, really calls upon this idea of class consciousness, right, of understanding that that clearly there is, to a certain extent, an anti-capitalist rhetoric here, in understanding that it's the governments, right, and these institutionalized systems that have really allowed for or forced people to leave their countries, right, and to migrate. And so I think that to a certain extent, that's where those continuities are. But at the same time, there is this rupture of still not being as critical of US imperialism, or even of Salvadoran, Central American, generally these governments. And part of it, I believe, is because of the moment and we're in, right? This rise to authoritarianism, the intense surveillance and repression of the US, of the left in both Central America and the US, that has really changed the terrain, right? And it has become more difficult to continue with this anti-imperialist politics. I will say that as of now, there's also, if we're thinking about the pandemic, if we're thinking about the hurricanes, which I know we'll get to in a bit, there's also an urgency of focusing on survival, right? On making sure, at least in the case of CIMITRA, making sure that they had bags of food, right, during the beginnings of the pandemic. And so in a way, their work is apolitical at the moment. And so it really is, it's a waiting game to see whether or not an organization like CIMITRA and others that, from my understanding, seems that will be emerging in other parts of Central America, but also in other places in the region, right, that are considered these migration corridors, that will support migrants across borders, right? Again, this borderless concept of solidarity, but also of the worker. And so Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting to see where these continuities and these ruptures were and how that connected. You know, how do we see it, solidarity now, and how can we envision it, you know, after the pandemic as well.
Okay, thank you all very much. And Stephanie, you also gave me a kind of a great transition to where I wanted to go with this next, is thinking about the events of the past months in Central America, and in particular the pandemic and the two major hurricanes that I think, you know, we've all maybe read about in the newspapers, but I wondered if all three of you could reflect on those sort of sound bites, news items from the perspective of the work that you do in Central America. So we don't have to stick with the order we were in before. If anyone wants to go first, they can. Otherwise, I can call on Shirley to go first if nobody else wants to volunteer.
Yes, what we know so far is that for the pandemic and for both hurricanes, the Garifuna, at least the Garifuna community in Livingston, was affected, you know, but I think the towns adjacent to Livingston were hit very badly, and that would be the areas of Morales and Amates, and that's where we see the bananeras, the area where the bananeras are located, and in the river, right, passing through from the north of Petén all the way to Honduras, right? So that's where we see the impacted towns being. But you know, what happens is that we see that for the Livingston is located in a very interesting location, right? It feels like you're in an island when you go there, because in order to get there, you need to take a boat. It's like a 30-minute ride boat to get to Livingston. So there's no a way to get there through land, so you have to get there. So it feels like you're in an island to get there, but there is it feels like they're not connected, or they're so disconnected with the rest of the country. So for what I heard during the pandemic, the very first weeks of the quarantine period, they needed to go into Puerto Barrios, you know, into the inland to get food, to buy anything they needed. But apparently there was a conflict between the two towns, because they didn't want to allow anybody coming from Livingston going into Puerto Barrios, and they didn't want to have anybody go into Livingston. So apparently there was a 3-week conflict, because they didn't want anybody to go in and out. And I mean, that caused a lot of stress among the people, because they couldn't get what they needed, all the resources they needed to get there. So you have to think about how the government is also cooperating and not cooperating, you know, and for Livingston, for 3 weeks to get a permit, or to get a pass, or to get, you know, a green light just to get provisions, I think is outrageous, you know, because it's what's going on in 3 weeks, you know. Luckily for the Garifuna community, or those that live there, I heard that they were prepared. They heard the news. They prepared for many of the weeks they knew that they needed to stay in. But you know, over time, that's, you know, the resources can only go so far. Like I said, they're not inland. They're away. from the main town. So it did affect them. They had other places to go to, like Rio Dulce. They could go there and get some of the resources. That was one of the alternatives that they eventually they felt that they had to go to Rio Dulce and not to Puerto Barrios, where most of the provisions were. But and as far as the hurricane, like I said, Livingston was not hit as bad as the other towns, but they got donations. Some of the organizations that were very active, they are very active, are in New York, like the Hijos de la Buga in New York. They're very active, and they not only raise money, but they were able to send, food and clothing and things that the community needed out there. So we know another community. This is a Garifuna community in Livingston, and that's the Iseri Bagari. They're one of the most active communities, organizations. Let me say organizations in Livingston, and they were able to organize for the pandemic and for the hurricane. So we know that they get resources, but not that organized by the government, but from other outside entities. So that's what we know so far about what's going on, and they're continuing with their efforts. As far as testing is concerned, for the pandemic, there was there are no testing centers. There's nothing that we know it's happening here in the States. What we know is that there are some tests available for people who they feel that they need it, or they suspect that they have symptoms and they need to test them right away. But it's a very limited, and it's highly controlled by the municipality of Livingston. So those who think that they may have the virus, they get tested, but it's very selective. So they don't have testing banks, or they're not. There's not such thing happening in Livingston. And for that, I can also echo for what's happening in Puerto Barrios, the adjacent town.
Okay, thank you. Marna, what about in Honduras?
Okay, unmuted myself. So particularly, I wanted to relate it before talking really about the immense and devastating impact that both hurricanes and the tropical storm has caused in Honduras. I want to connect it briefly to the article, because in the same way that our article discussed how the state's either action or inaction that has enhanced people's sense of insecurity when it comes to the hurricane and what has happened and the impact of the hurricane. It also brings up again the state's action, and more than anything, its inaction, and how its inaction has really caused so much damage. Because I think a lot of the conversation, or some of the conversation on the hurricane has focused on like the impacts of climate change and the fact that, of course, there was 2 hurricanes, one right after the other, and that they were of such high magnitude. And obviously that conversation is super, super interesting and relevant and important. But I think the voices on the ground and Hondurans who have been affected by the hurricanes themselves, I think the loudest message they've been communicating is just a complete outrage and anger towards a state that completely has disregarded and did not have an action plan, an emergency plan, doesn't have a long-term plan, didn't have an immediate plan, which I think just cements this idea that we talk about in our article, that not only do Hondurans not trust the state to protect them, they also don't trust that the state cares for them. And I think that was most vividly evident when looking at like the actions of the state at the time of the first hurricane hit, because at the beginning of November, the Honduran government was, instead of alerting the communities that are well known to be vulnerable, because in many times they're the same communities who were vulnerable and most affected by Hurricane Mitch in '98, instead of evacuating, preparing shelters, organizing donations, and putting in place a contingency plan that could obviously not eliminate the consequences of the hurricane, but could have definitely decreased the impact of it on people's lives, and particularly because these are vulnerable people's lives, right? These are poor communities who are the most affected by them. They're communities that have very high homicide rates and gang presence and state presence and violent state presence. And so it's these very communities who are migrating already, are forcibly being displaced from their homes, are also now being forcibly displaced, not only because of a hurricane, but because of the inaction of the state. And so as the hurricanes were coming close, and there was evidence to show that it was likely going to hit Honduras on the dates that it did, and that it was going to be of the magnitude that it was. Instead of evacuating these communities, the Honduran government was implementing and promoting and encouraging people from all around the country to go to the northern part of Honduras to participate in what they called the Semana Morazánica, which is their national yearly holiday week. And it was a huge effort to foment tourism and business, and with completely disregarding that there is a worldwide pandemic, and that Honduras's healthcare system which is already deteriorating before the pandemic, has been devastated because of the impact of the pandemic on people. And so they continued just encouraging people to take vacation. And it wasn't until the flooding began and that people were forced to leave their homes because like the water levels were entering, and they weren't able to it was clear that they had to leave, or they were going to either drown or die there. That the Honduran government then put out an alert, and then without immediately canceling the vacation week until a couple hours afterwards. And so what ended up happening is that those who could leave in time, they left in the middle of the night. They grabbed whatever they could and lived on the street or wherever the flooding was less. A lot of people. So like immediately after the first hurricane, and this only got increasingly worse after the second hurricane, like people were particularly in the northern part of Honduras, and the northern part of Honduras, although even the whole like northern coast, Puerto Cortes, La Ceiba, and then obviously La Mosquitia, which probably is the most affected because of the lack of access to there. You can only get there through helicopter, and to this day there's probably it's extremely difficult to reach. But what ended up happening in municipalities where people were able to escape is that they started just basically living on the street, and then those who weren't able to escape in time, many were sitting on their roofs of their homes, waiting to be rescued. Those who obviously had money or connections were trying to get people with someone who had a boat to come and take them and their families, but the complete lack of action on behalf of the state was so clear, and I think the outrage of people is so clear, and so to this day we're talking about thousands of people who've lost their homes, who are living currently in shelters and schools, or schools that are used as shelters, in extremely populated, densely populated, and are relying on donations and from churches and civil society, who really have, organized, and organized in the sense of collected donations and collected funds as much as they can, and like brought food and to people on the street, but also people in the shelters. But in general, like I think the most quotable and quote of that you hear is this is el pueblo ayudando al pueblo. Aquí el Estado no existe. It's the people helping the people. Here the state doesn't exist. For me, it's been the most clear and just vivid representation of what's been going on.
And before we move on to Stephanie, there was just a clarification question from Pablo Jose Lopez. The North Coast is difficult to reach. Could you explain that?
Yes. So it depends on what part of the North Coast, right? Because it's a pretty long extension. But yeah, so what was happening in some communities is because of like the water, the rivers that were near the neighborhoods, certain neighborhoods, like so the exact location of certain communities increased the flooding very like severely and very quickly. So entire neighborhoods became lakes. Like San Pedro Sula was essentially an island. And all roads were, or most roads, the principal roads, I mean, there's not many main roads, right? In Honduras, there's like one between each city. And so these all got inundated. And so when they are inundated, yeah, you have to rely on a boat, or you have to wait until the water goes down. And then what was also occurring was that the current of the water was like, between the homes or the lakes, the neighborhoods that became lakes, was so severe and so strong that even those who had, like, they call them lanchas, so they're boats with like motors, it was too dangerous to go and rescue. And all these rescue missions were collective efforts, fishermen and people from Garifuna communities also, because a lot of them have access to boats. It was their effort to rescue and to bring entire households, who were stuck on roofs, into parts of dry land. But what also happened is that, yeah, this takes a really long time, because even if the hurricane had passed, for example, within a couple of days, the water levels were still really high, and rain continued, which despite the hurricane passing, or the eye of the strongest part of the hurricane passing, yeah, it's not an immediate, an immediate improvement. So the water needs to go down, and then what the biggest problem was just the amount of mud that were blocking people's homes and like buried people alive. And so all of that, yes, it really restricts rescue missions and just the logistics of getting places.
Okay, Stephanie?
Yeah, so, this convergence of crisis, right? The health crisis, the pandemic, but also this climate crisis, right? These hurricanes, obviously brought solidarity from different groups, right? In El Salvador, obviously, the hurricanes and tropical storms didn't necessarily hit as bad as in other Central American countries, particularly Honduras and Nicaragua. But there was an organization that I'd like to talk to, actually, that is connected to Endelon and Simitra in a very different way, which is the National Tps Alliance, so the Temporary Protective Status community. This alliance emerged in 2017 as a response to Trump administration declaring a termination of this status, right? And one thing about this alliance is that they themselves, they see themselves as well as transnational beings, right? That although they spent 20 plus years here in the States, that they are in all, definitions, US citizens, except for the legal one, they still hold connections to their country. And one of the things that they did actually this past weekend was to hold a radioton. I don't actually know how to say that in English. A radioton on
the radio marathon.
Yeah, thank you. on Facebook Live, through the Radio Jornalera, which is part of Endelon. And their message is these, we were these people, right? These are our people. Many of them, especially Hondurans, right, left because of Hurricane Mitch, and were given TPS status because of Hurricane Mitch, and in the case of El Salvador, because of the earthquakes in 2001. And so really, their message is actually twofold. One, asking the US government, although they are critical about what they would give, right, or how genuine this aid is, but they're still asking, right, for the US to provide aid. But more importantly, they've asked to the government to extend TPS, not only for them, right, because they're still under this threat of being deported, but also provide TPS status specifically to Guatemalans, because Nicaraguans and Hondurans already here in the States, right, already have this TPS status. And there's also, connecting it to what Marna was saying, this distrust in the Honduran and Nicaraguan government as well, and Guatemalan government, in that the money that they were raising was to be given to trusted organizations and individuals that they knew, right? Not to the governments, because if not, as many of them said, there would be a repeat of what happened with Hurricane Mitch, right? And the focus on is sending money and not necessarily food, right? Or other items that, again, looking back at what happened during Hurricane Mitch, that they were mishandled, and much of that of those items, right, were never used, right? And so essentially there is again this transnational solidarity, right, of seeing themselves, the TPS Alliance at least, seeing themselves as part of this community, even though they live here in the US, right? Because they still have family there, because they see themselves in these communities. And there's still, we'll see what happens, whether this, the hurricane and the aftermath of it will lead to even more people migrating north, right? And so that's also another question of thinking about how will that solidarity look, if there is, and there probably will be another surge of migration because of the climate crisis.
So it's really interesting listening to the three of you talk about the role of the state, the incapacity of the state to either the absence of the state or the presence of the state only in its so-called security, military, violent guise insofar as the populations. And Of course, Central America is not new to natural disasters. And if we look back into in the 1970s, some of the governmental responses that you're talking about sound so familiar in terms of, foreign aid pouring in, going into the pockets of right-wing regimes and their allies. And some of these earthquake in Nicaragua and Guatemala being really catalysts for the growth of revolutionary movements. And what you said, Marna, about el pueblo ayudando al pueblo, that people feeling like we have to take this into our own hands. And it also just made me think about, a lot of what you're describing is the neoliberal state, right? That's what we know as the neoliberal state, is the state that that exists only in its militarized form. The social welfare aspects of the state are gone, and what remains is the security aspect of the state. But that in some senses, that's not new at all in Central America. Neoliberalism, like in a way it started in the 1990s, but in a way it's been like all of Central America's history, at least that aspect of neoliberalism. We're starting to see a few questions come in, which is great. So we're just almost at 7 o'clock here. So I'd like to urge everybody to start posting up your questions. But I'm going to read the first one, which is for Stephanie and for me. How do you feel about the ways that the FMLN and FSLN have changed from the 1980s to the present as once authentically popular parties/movements? Do you attribute this change to the ravages of US-sponsored counter-revolution and neoliberalism, or the corruption of individuals like Ortega, or both? I don't know, Stephanie, do you want to take a stab at that, or else I will first and you can follow me, whichever you prefer.
I can quickly say, I think it's both. Right, these were FMLN, FSLN were revolution. They had these revolutionary projects of essentially bringing in socialism, right, to Nicaragua and El Salvador, at least at the beginning. And once, in the case of Nicaragua, once they were in power, things change, right? And with the Contra wars, there was really no opportunity, or limited opportunity, to really see that project go far. And in the case of El Salvador, right, once the FMLN becomes a political party, and after several decades of the Arena party, right, the right-wing party, being in power, and this rise of neoliberalism, I mean, it's a completely different state, right? A completely different state in which the FMLN comes into power. And obviously with power, there's, I'm generalizing, but with power, there's corruption. I think what's interesting is, Avi, you actually brought this up earlier, again, this idea of disillusionment of the people, right? But also the continuing resistance of the people, and regardless of whether the governments are working for them or not, right? We can think very recently with the anti-mining campaigns in El Salvador, that it's the people, right, who are pushing forth these changes, pushing forth, challenging the status quo and whatnot. And so, I mean, yeah, generally it's both. Avi, I don't know if you want to add more to that.
Yeah, I'll just say a few other things, but basically I'll agree with you. It's both. But just to mention a few other specifics that I've been thinking about. One is that leading an armed guerrilla movement is not necessarily the best preparation for governing. And I think that there's strong revolutionary democratic ideologies in both the Sandinistas and the FMLN, but there's also a high degree of vanguardism in both organizations, of mostly young male leaders thinking they knew everything. I also think it's important to point out how many died in these wars. This is one of the things that just really struck me in reading Matilda Zimmerman's book about the Sandinistas, is who survived to even run the country after the Sandinista victory. So many of the people, the leadership who died, it could have been a very different composition of the Sandinista leadership, but it was the survivors, and it was a bunch of young guys. But also the experience of guerrilla warfare is an experience of clandestinity, of top-down, of secrecy, of obedience. And that's what I mean by it's not necessarily the best preparation for revolutionary democratic governance. But also, of course, you know, the Nicaraguan revolution is forced by circumstance being the United States, to continue warfare, to devote the country's resources, which could have been devoted towards building, at the very least, a robust kind of social welfare state, are going towards the war. There's the draft, which of course is incredibly disillusioning for people who fought the war and won the war, and then they're asked to sacrifice their sons again. Sons and daughters again. There's the ongoing death. So the disillusionment, and of course the FMLN, things progress differently in El Salvador, but the peace agreement in El Salvador granted a lot more to the FMLN as a party than it did to the peasantry as a constituency of the FMLN. So it was a political resolution, but it wasn't really a socioeconomic resolution to the war. So, you know, it's stacked against the FMLN as political leaders who gained something from the peace agreement against the peasantry who didn't. And I mean stacked against them in terms of disillusionment, like, you know, we're the ones who suffered and now we lost. The final thing that I would say is that I find Richard Stahler-Schultz's concept that he uses talking about the Zapatistas of autonomy without resources as a really useful one for thinking about what happened both to revolutionary movements in the United States in the 1960s, 1970s, and in Latin America, that there were these civil rights concessions in the United States that allow a Black political class to emerge and to actually govern cities. There's this sort of neoliberal multiculturalism that allows for different types of autonomy. And I think we could say decolonization is, so I'm looking at sort of different levels of this creations of autonomies, whether it's Black-run cities in the United States, whether it's independent countries like Nicaragua, or whether it's autonomous territories in neoliberal multicultural governments, where former revolutionaries are granted political autonomy, but without resources. And to try to govern without resources, well, the people you're governing are not going to be happy campers if there are no resources. Like, you can't implement revolutionary change if all you have is this political position without any resources to actually implement change. So Stephanie, you look kind of puzzled, but okay. So yeah, I think in terms of thinking about what happens to movements like the Sandinistas, like the FMLN, autonomy without resources is a useful concept to think about also in terms of governance. So there's another question. This is from Vincent Goronsky. I've been working on a heuristic model for understanding how disasters, violence, crime, and migration interact in complex ways. How do you see these forces interacting in Central America during the pandemic and the hurricane. Disasters, violence, crime, and migration. Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
I can try to respond. Okay. So obviously this is a broad question, and I can probably only give you from my perspective and based on my research. But my immediate thoughts on your question are that disasters, in particular in Honduras, I would say aggravate and reveal the problems that have already existed. So when we're looking at violence and crime and migration, disasters have aggravated this. So even just more recently, most recently with the hurricanes, it is, I mean, not only is it expected, but it is, people are already talking about another caravan and about migrating to the United States, people who are in the shelters, who have lost their homes, who have lost essentially everything. And even though that sentiment is already so widely shared in Honduras, as demonstrated, right, most evidently through the caravans, the fact that so many more people have lost their homes and are unable to go back is just a huge effect. Like it's just the reality. That is the consequence of the hurricane. But not only is it the consequence of the hurricane, it's the consequence of a state that hasn't put in place the measures so that the impact isn't as strong as it has been. And I think particularly, and then the other thing I wanted to mention is that when looking at the communities I've researched in and been present in, and also when looking at the patterns of urbanization and how these communities started, the story becomes quite clear that as rural migration to urbanization, rapid urbanization occurred, starting in the 70s and late 70s and 80s, and the state was mostly absent from this process of urbanization. So poor farmers, but as well as workers living in the city that were living in, densely populated like cuarterias, so like boarding homes where you rent a room, like they started then taking land and in settling in an organized manner, and creating what is termed like an informal settlement, which then bit by bit has become formalized, and that is the origin of a lot of the communities that have been affected by Hurricane Mitch 98 and then are affected again today. And the issue with this is that without the presence of the state, that this occurs in an unregulated manner. And so there's a lot of corruption in how these communities are like formed. So people are taking advantage and are selling plots of land that they don't actually own. And then people with less resources are then forced to locate in areas where where people don't want to live. So these are usually places that are at risk, like geologically speaking, that are near the rivers. And so it creates this so much inequality, and it actively puts those with least resources at risk. Because of where they build their homes, or because where they try to make a living. And so what you see is that because of the absence of the state since the beginning, this immediately places these communities at risk, which then is aggravated when hurricanes occurs, but also is aggravated because the lack of state presence also allows for gangs, to many times take up the role that the state has failed to take. And so it creates in Honduras, it's very clear, like the cycles that are continuously happening because of the role of the state and the vulnerability of people as a result.
I guess I would just also add to that, since one of our themes is this sort of comparison to the 1980s, but the crushing of a revolutionary alternative. That, like, not only do you have the violent and absent state, but the potential for building something different has just been crushed so many times. There's a lot more questions coming in. Maybe I will read a couple of them. Well, let's see what we can do. We'll go one by one for now. From Hillary Goodfriend, thanks to all for your excellent work. I have a question for all about Biden's $4 billion plan for Central America and what kind of policy we can expect from the new administration towards the region. What are some of the biggest areas of struggle you identify going forward?
I wish I can have a real answer on behalf of the Garifuna community. I don't think that any of those funds are gonna impact directly the community. It's just something that it's a problem. It's a bigger problem. The Garifuna community and other Afro-Indigenous communities in Guatemala are just marginalized to the point that they are non-existent. So just how I stated in the article, these are communities that are, in many cases, with the people I spoke, they said they feel invisible. You know, there are invisible communities. They feel invisible. They feel that the state doesn't hear them. There are things that they don't feel included. So a lot of the policies are never focused on these communities. They are not part of the narrative. Okay, and in the Garifuna community, it's a very resilient community. They organize themselves. They feel that the state are not gonna, historically speaking, they've never been there. So they're gonna find the resources they need on their own. They're gonna organize on their own. They're gonna speak and look for those alliances outside Guatemala. They go out and try to find the help they need from other people, that they can hear them, that they can address their situation. But in one of the biggest problems to me right now is the Garifuna population is decreasing. There's a massive exodus of Garifunas in Livingston. I mean, just to approximately around 8,000 Garifunas were there, you know, during the 1960s or prior to the war. You know, that's just an approximate number. Keep in mind that Guatemala never keeps accurate census, and the Garifunas were hardly counted back in the day. You know, just Guatemala had the most recent census was in 2018. You know, the one before that, I think it was 2002. So the most recent numbers we have around, you know, 1,675 Garifunas in Livingston as we speak, you know. So I think the massive exodus, the violence, the lack of opportunities, racism is one of the, you know, it's just there, it's present, they know it, they have to find different ways to help their communities. So when they leave, the Garifunas, I feel that they have this commitment to the land. You know, many of them return. Others, they have this. They leave to help their families and friends. But as far as this aid that our compañera talks about, I don't think that's something that will impact the Garifuna community directly. Or any other Afro-Indigenous communities in the area. That's not money for them. unfortunately.
Marna, Stephanie, did you want to add anything to that?
Honestly, yeah, I don't know. We're talking about disillusionment, right? I don't even know if there was any illusionment in the first place, but you know, if we see his past record, right? I mean, yeah, things can change, but if we see his past record with, as a vice president under the Obama administration, I mean, how much can we really expect from this aid? I mean, because I brought up the National TPS Alliance, it's what's in my mind right now. He made, the statement about Central Americans here, or at least Hondurans, Nicaraguans, and Salvadorans who have this TPS status, that he's working on a pathway to citizenship for them, right? Whether that happens or not, it's, who knows? But I'm not expecting much with this plan to Central America. I mean, I don't really have any specifics to talk about, but I don't know. It's not really an answer. It's just my feelings toward this.
I guess I would also just add that, I mean, we have Biden's record as the vice president for Obama. And, of course, the Honduran coup in 2009 is a big stain on the Obama administration. But I think we also see a remarkable consistency in U.S. aid towards Central America from a bipartisan consistency, which is that aid goes to what they call security. That is, it's arms, it's policing, it's military. Or it goes to, it goes to forms of economic development that do not help the poor. There has been a really consistent model of foreign investment, opening to foreign investment, so-called free trade benefits for corporations, and export-oriented development under the hands of elites and foreigners that we have seen that for 500 years has not benefited the poor of Central America. So, and I haven't seen any signs of thoughts about questioning that model of economic development and promotion of that model of economic development anywhere among the US political class. Sylvia Simoni, many thanks to Marna and co-authors Amelia and Liz for their critical perspective on how deep the fear of top-tier authorities reigns in Honduras. The article mentions you interviewed fiscales in 6 municipalities. Did you notice any patterns between these municipalities? For example, whether they're mostly urban or located in Sula Valley or near Tegus, or whether these municipalities were affiliated with the National Party? How much does party affiliation play a part in how safe or protected fiscales feel in their line of work? I'm also wondering whether USAID operations were present in all 6 places, speaking of US aid, and whether this had any impact on the fiscales' perspectives.
Yes, so this is a very relevant question. So we actually purposely chose the municipalities where USAID has focused its aid and attention to. They're generally the largest municipalities in Honduras. So it was Tegucigalpa, San Pedro, Choloma, La Lima, El Progreso, and La Ceiba, and Tela. And yes, I definitely, so in terms of patterns that we observed, one of the interesting patterns for me was to see the differences between the rhetoric used by, the rhetoric and the perspective of the fiscales, the fiscales as well as the police and the medical examiners in the capital, in Tegucigalpa, in relation to the smaller municipalities. So in Tegucigalpa, we were meeting with higher up officials, and they definitely were strategically put in their positions because they were part of the National Party and advocates for Juan Orlando. So I mean, while we were interviewing the medical examiner in Tegucigalpa, she just went on and on about how collecting homicides was so challenging because they were going into the jungle and going into the mountains and picking up bodies, where we're like, okay, we know Tegucigalpa has one of the highest homicide rates, and that these homicide rates are focalized in specific urban neighborhoods. And so there was definitely, a very big discrepancy. Also, we met with the director of the DPI in Tegucigalpa, who had gone across the entire world studying, had a PhD from Harvard, and was just raving about how great the investigative police office, the new unit was, and also how concerning it was that they were lacking equipment to combat cybersecurity. And for us, that caused kind of a big laugh, because it seems like there's a lot more important and structural problems in Honduras, like the actual necessity to carry out an investigation and a conviction in cases of homicide. Seems like a much more pertinent problem to be focused on than cybersecurity. So there was, and then when we went to smaller municipalities, we found that, and increasingly municipalities outside of Tegucigalpa, so obviously in La Ceiba and in San Pedro, yes, the fiscales were notably more from the Partido from Libre or Liberal, but mostly against the government. At the time, we were doing the interviews in the middle of the protests against the privatization of education and health. And so the fiscales were actually, surprisingly very open and critical. And it was one of the first times that they were extremely critical, that we heard, at least in our interviews with authorities, that they were critical of US aid and how US aid implements its own agenda, or gives funding, and a lot of funding, but says what needs to be done with the funding. And these are offices that had all received, aid in different ways, if not through computers or even vehicles or the building remodeling. And so that there was definitely a clear, and then the other thing was that because it was in the middle of the protest, as soon as we had a business card that said human rights researcher, and they got really excited, about, they're like, oh, human rights, we believe in human rights. And they were actually very vocal against the United States and putting kids in cages. And so that it was really not something we expected from our interviews with the Honduran authorities. But definitely that was more in the northern part of the country. Yeah, and it was a big contrast to the capital. I hope that answers your question.
So I am seeing the end of our hour and a half drawing near. So I think what I want to do is read a couple more kind of big general questions. There's also a lot of several specific questions here, but I'll read the general questions and then I'll just open it up to the three of you if you want to say anything, your concluding statement, either in answer to those questions or just what you want to say. Cassie asks, are there specific actions that the people in the webinar can take in solidarity, politically, support, etc.? Pamela Yates asks, why do those of you who mentioned erasure and forgetting or co-optation vis-a-vis the 1980s think it occurred? Avi, you said that the revolutionary movements and wars of the time are unknown today, especially when the national conversation revolves around the why of immigration from Central America. Stephanie, you say that solidarity is less radical today, focused on human and environmental defense, but with no discourse of the patriarchy or neoliberalism. Is that because human rights is safer and less about structural change, in your opinion? Is it an either-or situation or a false dichotomy? And then Pamela also asks, and what can we do to revive this and the hidden history of the Garifuna in Guatemala to activists today? Cassie also asked, how can we support the Afro-Indigenous people in Guatemala? Fanny Garcia asks, I'm wondering if any of you think we can make the administration feel guilty about their past actions and move them through activism and policy lobbying towards reparations and reconciliation. So you each have a minute and a half to make your final statement and try to answer any of those questions that you want to try to answer in it. You can have 2 minutes, maybe.
Okay, we'll try our best. Well, there's a greater need to change in order to update the narrative, about the Afro-Indigenous communities in Guatemala. I think that we are at a point where these communities are no longer invisible. They're there, they're organizing, the youth is amazing. They're bright, they're smart, they have so much energy, and they are ready. They're ready for the fight. So I'm very excited to work with many of them. And as far as how to revive this and the hidden histories of the Garifuna in Guatemala, I think that the piece that I wrote, to me, as a digital historian and an archivist, I feel that there's a greater need to start archiving these oral histories. It is time to start documenting these stories and do something with them, and we can start by really sharing this information, start sharing what these specifically the Garifuna community lived during the times of war. We don't know much about it. We don't know that, we didn't know that a lot of the Garifunas were recruited and they were part of the military, and how many of them died in combat, and we still don't know their names. They're not registered in the Commission of Historical Clarification that I mentioned, completely omitted, and they were not shy about to say that they were going to admit, and that they were only going to focus on the communities that suffer the most, and I believe that, the community didn't need to suffer a major massacre in order for these stories to be counted. So I think that start looking at those histories that we know that we probably don't think it really happened. It probably did happen to them, and it did happen in many, many, many ways. And very briefly, during the 1980s, as the war is happening in Guatemala, the AIDS crisis was also happening, and it hit Livingstone and the Afro-Indigenous communities like no one, and nobody talked about it. And we can only, in documenting the stories of war, I came to the information that 9 women in Livingstone organized, to start educating the community about AIDS. They had no idea how AIDS got into Livingstone, and they didn't have the resources or the information, to the point that they thought the ancestors had were punishing the community. That's what the early belief of why so many people were dying in the community about, with the AIDS pandemic. So what we know is that that is kind of the stories that we need to document, and we need to talk about, and we need to learn about why this happened, and by bringing them out to light and archiving them, I feel like we're going to be helping the activists today, the youth, so that they can talk about these experiences and start organizing and knowing that they are part of the national narrative. Until right now, a lot of the Garifunas had the belief that or felt that they couldn't contribute to a class discussion because they were not part of the class discussion. They were not part of the history. Now with these stories that are unveiling, they can go into a classroom and say, yes, this is how we lived the war, and this is how my family experience that, and how many of them, were affected by it. So, to support some of the Afro-Indigenous communities in Guatemala, I can just give you one right off the bat, Iseri Ibagari, and I'll just put it in the chat. Iseri Ibagari is one of the the organizations, nonprofit, that is for supporting the community, not only the Garifuna community, but other indigenous communities that also live in Livingstone, and they are in charge of all kinds of health and services to the community. And they have a Facebook page, so you can really go there and donate any kind of support resources that you have. So, and this is not over. Very briefly, this is not over. We're gonna continue interviewing. There's a project coming where we're gonna be interviewing more people about these histories of war, and we hope that we are able to bring this to a broader audience.
Okay, thank you. Marna?
So in terms of solidarity, and what you can do from wherever you're located, I think for me, I really firmly believe that like change, the most effective and longstanding change occurs from the grassroots and from the bottom. Although of course it's important to advocate and guilt trip, as someone questioned the government, I'm more skeptical about the effectiveness of that. Although I do think it is extremely important to draw connections and discuss and reveal those connections to people in power about what was happening back in the 70s and 80s is repeating itself, and it is continuing today. So obviously I do think that is important, but I think for me the biggest sign and an activity of solidarity would be to actively counteract a lot of the hateful and harmful discussions and ideas surrounding well, for me particularly Honduran migrants, but of course Guatemalan, Salvadoran migrants from the Northern Triangle and from Mexico who are arriving to the United States looking for jobs and opportunities and just a chance for surviving and living life, which they are not granted and not able to do in their home country, where they much rather would prefer to do it. So I think counteracting those narratives that have criminalized particularly young men, who I think there's a lot of sympathy for children or people who have rightful or particular profiles that fit into asylum claims, but the truth is, because of the nature of the problems in the region, so many people are vulnerable, and so many people migrate because they really have no other opportunity for life to live in their country. So counteracting, whether through conversation or with your peers or friends or family members or however that looks for you, I think is really important and shouldn't be underestimated.
Great, thank you. Stephanie?
Yeah, I just very quickly, I want to echo what Marna said. I'm also very skeptical about whether we can guilt trip the administration, but it is important to make those connections, right, for them to see. But even what's more is also, to support the people on the ground that are doing that, right? And I think this ties into, in terms of support for Central America, there are a lot of Central American organizations, Central American people in social media, for example, right? At this moment in which we can't really do a whole lot of interacting with face-to-face or anything like that, right? Social media has been a vehicle at this moment to not only educate other folks about what's going on in Central America, but also to make those kinds of connections, right? Of what's happening now to, what happened in the 70s and 80s. And, trying to force the US to be accountable too. So I think that at least as a first step, supporting these communities on the ground, whether they're here in the US or whether they're in Central America, but just digging in through social media. The Centam Collective, for example, is one, which are Central Americans in the diaspora here, right, that are in constant conversation with what's going on, not only here in the diaspora, but also in Central America. And they also provide information about on the ground grassroots organizations in Central America, right, and how to support that. So that's just, very quickly one way that you can support.
Okay. Heather, did you want to make any closing remarks here?
I have no closing remarks other than thank you so much to all of you. This has been such a just riveting discussion. The time has flown by and it's kind of sad to see it end. So thank you again to Marna, Stephanie, and Shirley for your pieces and sharing your insights with us. And thank you, Avi, for moderating, and to everyone who asked questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all of them. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. This has been recorded, so we will post it online. If anyone was unable to make it, you'll have a chance to share that and watch it later. We'll be sharing on our YouTube page, and we'll make an announcement on social media and in our newsletter so that folks can find it. Thanks so much.
Great.